cold. It was cold all the way.
I had everything. Or I should say, to circulation and bones, I've got everything.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning. Oh my goodness. It's time to go to Arizona. You're well?
Got coffee creamer on me.
Oh, all right.
Sticky.
I imagine it feels pretty good sometimes.
What's your cup say?
It says, "Be careful, or you'll end up in my sermon." Christy got it for me on my birthday back in May. All right, good morning, everybody. I know there's only a few of us here this morning, but that's all right. We'll do okay. We are in the book of Romans. We still are in chapter 1. We didn't get through all the way to chapter 1 last week. So that's where we're going to pick up and hopefully get maybe through 2, depending how talkative you guys are. So we'll see. But last week we kind of started the book of Romans. I gave a little bit of background on it, and that's kind of why we're behind a little bit here as well. But last week we got into the first half or so of Romans. We talked about Paul's greeting to them and his sharing about why he wanted to go to Rome and how he wanted to be with them and how it just seemed like no matter what, he keeps getting stopped up, right? And that's kind of wordage that Paul would use quite often, and he'll say the devil is a thorn in his flesh for the same exact reason of not letting him go places and making him be stuck. But that would make sense. We think he's probably under house arrest about the time that he's writing this, so that would make sense as why he can't go visit Rome, and he keeps getting hindered to do so. Let's see. And then we got down to verse 16 and 17, and we talked about that for a good minute. But I want to go ahead and read 16 and 17 again, because I think they tie into going forward here in 18. So we go from the middle of Romans, there's kind of a switch up here, and I think that's all right. So let's go ahead and read verses 16 and 17 of Romans chapter 1 again, and then let's see how they switch into this next thought here at 18. All right. So Romans chapter 1, verse 16 says, For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and then also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. We talked about those verses a little bit last week and how really powerful they are. Talking about how Paul himself, but also sharing to the rest of Christians now, are not ashamed to share this with everyone. Jews, Greeks, doesn't matter. The call is there the same. So that's what the righteous do. The righteous live by faith. But then it transitions into, my Bible actually has a heading here at verse 18, the unrighteous. So we go from the righteous, those who follow God, those who have faith in God, then to the unrighteous immediately thereafter. So let's pick up in verse 18 and let's read. Yeah, I think we're going to have to go to the end of the chapter. I think it's all one thought. I don't think we can stop. So let's go 18 to 32. Romans 1, 18 to 32 talk about the unrighteous. All right, so Paul writes, For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they know God, They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds, and animals, and creeping things. Pause here. I think we talked about this part just a little bit last week, right? But we'll keep going here in a second. So what's the first parts that Paul is sharing about these unrighteous people?
They knew God.
They knew God. It's almost, he basically writes it as, it's impossible to ignore God, unless you decide to, right? But he says, instead of following God, what have they done now? They've ignored God and done their own thing. Okay, that's a pretty nice way of saying it. Kind of found their own pride, followed their own wisdom, created their own gods, and then we talked about this part last week, started worshiping man, birds, and animals, and creeping things. So what we talked about last week is how they shifted from, instead of worshiping God, worshiping the Creator, to worshiping the created things, like they were the God. And so, again, we see a pretty stark transition from those by faith into those who are unrighteous right there in the beginning. So we talked through that verse 23 last week, all the way through verse 23. Is there any comments that you guys didn't get to share? Because that's where we stopped, I'm pretty sure. Dennis?
We think of you bannies and cannibals and stuff, worshiping the gods and all that, but we got guys that climb rocks and take pictures,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't develop this over here in housing for people because there's a rare lizard,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say we got our priorities plumb upside down.
Sure. Yeah, this is not something that's old and gone away with. That's kind of an important thing. Talked about it a little bit last week. We still have this mindset very, very prevalent in our culture. You see it in our part of the country a lot. This worship the creation over the creator mindset. Because here's the thing. We all love the creation. I don't think there's anyone in this room that would say, you know what? Tetons are just the ugliest things. Can't believe that God made them so pointy and stuff. Right? We wouldn't ever say that because we love the creation, but we look at it from the point of God did that.
It's not just because it's pretty, but if you look at it, these people, they looked into natural things, and they could see at least any part of it. But God made things that interact with each other in this world. This thing, trees use carbon dioxide and give off oxygen. We use oxygen, give off carbon dioxide. This thing does this, but this thing counteracts it. This thing does this, and that. Everything builds on each other. Everything's interwound with everything.
Mm-hmm.
To do that just spontaneously, and to do that just itself doing that. These people would understand, and they do. If they just think about it, they just don't think, what the heck? That can't happen without intelligence behind it. They knew that, and we know that. But we got the same thing today.
Yeah.
We got people, this whole world is going nuts. As far as green stuff and everything else. So it's the same thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'll get to here in a second, Terry. Again, building on this idea of it hasn't gone away, we definitely still see it happening.
Yes.
And it's not the fact that we, different parties here, let's just say we have two parties here, creator, creation, okay? It's not the fact that those who only believe in the creation and worship it don't believe in the systems and the cycles. They have just, we've talked about, decided to say, all right, this is how it is, and I'm going to leave God off of it. Start in the middle and look at the end, instead of look at the whole thing. Terry?
I think it's interesting, we've talked about nature and animals and things, but the first thing that he says is mortal man. And Scientology and all of the, humans can become perfect if you work on it. The worship here is, I don't want anybody to tell me what to do, or that I'm not perfect in myself, and therefore, I'm the ultimate
Absolutely.
I think that's one of the reasons that Scientology is so big in certain areas, the types of people. I know it's huge in Hollywood. These are the kinds of people who live for themselves and their egos to some extent, and Scientology makes perfect sense to them.
Sure. Well, and it doesn't even have to go as far as Scientology. Let's say some things that won't get me fired. Politics could be the same thing, right? Here's the thing. Meditation, inner focus, that's getting close to Scientology. That is a biblical principle. Meditation, times of silence and refocus are biblical.
That's what you're meditating on, though.
That's the whole point, right? Western meditation has turned into find your inner being. Find yourself. Well, actually, meditation is get your stupid self out of there and just listen to what anything God has to say. And he might use the birds in the air and the, sure, but we can't focus in on ourselves. So, mortal man focusing in on ourselves, thinking we are the God, thinking the creation is the God, but the whole time, just trying to jump the first thing, God.
And I mean, there's, like you said, we can look at those things, and we should. I mean, Jesus said, consider the lilies.
Mm-hmm.
Proverbs says, consider the ant, thou sluggard. But neither place says, worship the ant, worship the lily.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. Consider is a good word because, it's not worship, no doubt. All right, so we see why they're unrighteous and what they've been doing. Let's see what Paul has to say to that effect, all right? So that's starting there in verse 24. So what's God doing with this? What's Paul saying about it? Verse 24, therefore God gave them up into the lusts of their hearts and to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Well, that sounds like what we were just talking about, doesn't it? Verse 26, for the reason God gave them up to their dishonorable passions, for the women exchanged natural relations for those who are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women's and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving them themselves with due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave up on them, debased their mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, contentiousness, malice, the full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to their parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So what's God's response to these people? Oh, these people, that's a little too broad. People we probably know. What's God's response to people we probably know that worship their own power, worship the creation? What's he say?
The day's coming, he does not let sin go by, even though, it's not acute, it's more chronic, you might say, it takes a wee bit to do it, it'll take all the time it needs. 28 to 31, that's the exact opposite of 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8. Exact opposite.
You're saying topic for topic, right? Right, so we taught 1 Corinthians 13 talking about what love is that we read about last week, read that same scripture. This is opposite for that. Let me hit something Craig said here. He said something about chronic. Basically, God says, all right, you got sick, I'm going to make it an illness. He said, if you really want that, you decide you want this, you love this sickness so much, have it all, right? And that's kind of his response to it. He said, just keep on going.
It's kind of hard to think about that, that's true. But, God doesn't want anybody to perish. But he gives his own unrighteous righteousness. I know Paul said he gave, who was it, over the devil to, but he was hoping that to teach him a lesson. I don't know if this is going to teach these people a lesson.
Yeah, we haven't
done. It's hard to believe that he did, but it doesn't sound like they'll come back after a while, but
Well, I mean, we will go in here, and we'll talk about it here in a second. God is going to judge on these things. But here's the big transition verse that I say this with, that God says, all right, have it. It's verse 24. Therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. And then verse 25 tells why, which we've been talking about. Why? But he says he gave them up to destroy their bodies, destroy their hearts, destroy their minds.
Verse 25, I read it a while ago with a different slant on it.
Okay.
The face value thing, which I'm sure what Paul meant, but I was thinking they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Now we're reading here the truth of God.
Mm-hmm.
But you watch these TV shows and stuff, now they always got to have these gays in them. And this long list of bad stuff we see at the end of the chapter, big long list. That's all the other people. These gays live a perfect life and don't have any of these faults at all, but all the people that criticize them do. And I'd say they're exchanging the truth of God for a lie. But have you watch, when they show them on TV, that they're always the really good guy or a good girl you like on the show, and all the people that ain't in their groove, they are the rotten, evil.
Narrow-minded.
So, what we're taking out of that is Dennis's favorite characters on the shows are the charismatic homosexual people. Okay, we'll write that one down.
They're likable people.
They are, right.
Right.
Well, I mean, you can see that. We can apply it to lots of other things. You picked one out of the list of many here, right? That is in the list that we just read of things to give yourselves into.
Terry just brought us something. We're narrow-minded.
Yeah,
These people are narrow-minded,
that's funny. Yeah.
And everybody, they sure are,
Well, let's tie Dennis's and Terry's back together here because they work together. They're narrow-minded. They think this is the only way to live life.
They think we're narrow-minded.
Yeah.
They think, that's
Well, that means they're narrow-minded too, right? So they think, I'm the only way. This is the way I'm doing it. And because of that, they are rejoiceful and happy in the lifestyle they live. Even though we just read about, it doesn't matter which piece you pick to start with. You're going down the road of dishonoring your body, dishonoring your mind, leaving God.
And actually, being narrow-minded is a good thing because you should worship the Creator instead of creation. There's way more objects in the creation, so yeah, it's good to be narrow-minded in that way.
In the right way,
Yes.
because we're just talking here opposite.
We
And
worship one thing. These people worship thousands of things.
right, but they can be narrow-minded,
Don't be
focusing
narrow-minded.
on theirs too, right? So it's all about the right way. You have to acknowledge. We just have to acknowledge. We can all get stuck on our thing, and if it's the wrong thing you're stuck on, it's not a good deal. That's what Paul's writing on behalf of God right here. All right, so he goes through the list, and I think the list is more not a list of everything bad that I could think of today, sincerely Paul. I think it's him saying, this is what it turns into. When you give yourself over to following yourself, how easily is it that you're just moving on into the next thing, right? And there's some, what many of us would consider kind of vile things here in the last little bit of evil. Terry?
I think it's really interesting, though. You could go through this and go, there's evil and depravity and murder and strife and malice and God-haters and insolent and arrogant and boastful. And then you go back and go, okay, and he also said greed
Mm-hmm.
and envy and disobeying your parents. So there are some things in there that we don't think of. I mean, let's face it, we don't equate evil, murder, and gossip as the same level. And Paul isn't
Sure.
making a whole lot of distinctions here. He's not going between, big sins and little sins and white lies and big lies and that kind of thing. He's just lumping it all together.
You're totally right. Also,
It's scary.
from the very get-go, talking about those who, follow mortal man and the things of creation? All of you felt like you were not convicted by that? Never been caught up in that yourself? Ever done something really well and say, hey, look at what I did? Ever done something absolutely trash terrible and you can't get over it? That's my problem, right? What is that? That's me kind of worshiping mortal man because I'm stuck on what man can do. So I'm not saying that, my whole life is devoted to worshiping. I'm just saying I will stumble on that. And then we come down to the list, like Terry was talking about here. And there's some of these that we would consider not a big deal. And some of these we would consider huge deals. But Paul's saying all of these are following not God. So let's talk about evil and unrighteousness. That happens even to the best of us. Malice, envy, well, that happens to the best of us. Envy is a huge one in our culture. If we'd ever acknowledge it, it's there. Slanderers, haughty, boastful, disobedient to parents. That just sounds like a normal Thursday.
Go back to boastful and watch Instagram or Facebook.
Absolutely.
One of those.
Absolutely. Foolish is on this list.
What is?
Foolish.
Foolish.
And again, that's something we kind of just, not a big deal, but man, as a culture, we have lots of additives even to make ourselves foolish so we don't have to worry about things. Nancy?
Where is it? Proverbs, please, I can't remember. I bring this up again. The start of wisdom is a fear of God. So if you're foolish, you don't fear God. It goes hand in hand, right?
Absolutely. I think they go hand in hand. We're not talking about wisdom, so I won't get too into it, but when we talk Proverbs 8, 9, 10, wisdom chapters, okay? It says wisdom was there at the beginning. And so to say wisdom and God are separate would be a foolishness because it's all one part. God was there with wisdom.
I'm not sure it's not in here. Read verse 28. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. I have a little note there that somebody said that word retain means they let it go. So they had some sort of knowledge and wisdom at some time.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's kind of how this section started too. Like you know of God. Dennis?
Yeah, Terry she just stole my exact thought and verse. But Paul, all through Paul's writings, if you notice, he will juxtapose the good against the bad or the wrong against the right or what used to be against the now.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one, I think, verse 28 goes right, kind of referring maybe back to those first 20s, were 18 through 22 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
People used to know it and so on. And then they did not think it was worthwhile to retain their knowledge of God. And not like they never had it, so they can't help themselves, but they didn't think it was worth keeping.
Something interesting, and I wasn't going to necessarily talk about it, but whatever. It's interesting. I don't think there's a generational line there.
No.
We think that, and we're like, oh, well, every man, at the age of 2 knows God, and they're like, oh, God, I know you. And then by the age of 10, they might, no. I think this can pass from generations, right? So mankind knew of God. Then the decision, for some of us at least, was made to be, no, we worship what we can do, what we have, what's around us. And that gets passed, much like your faith in God can be passed. And so this doesn't just start at each fresh birth, everybody knows God. No, I think this really goes from generation to generation. You pass what you know or what you follow. Here is more better. So, God or me? You pass it. I don't think it resets at generations. So, something convicting to think about, not in there. Harold's thought.
It's not biblical, but I believe myself that God speaks with babies. I think they converse actually. There's evidence, of kids saying things that, whoa, so I don't know, but that's my feelings.
I don't know either.
They know God when they're born. They know God, and I think they, God speaks to can be in the presence of unsinful, some of it's not sinful, baby's not sinful.
Mhm.
So add up things, and it's just me. But I think God speaks to babies, intimately, so they do know God, right off the get-go. I do believe that.
All right, I can't speak to that, especially from Romans chapter 1, but Dennis?
Well, yeah, he's kind of a little bit afield, but he's not wrong. But it ain't so important that God speaks to babies, but babies speak to us, and we're told that they're the kingdom of God.
Yep.
And from the mouths of babes, and a child shall lead them, and stuff like this. Now, he can't mean it. I don't need to listen to him. He's 8 months. maybe we should reconsider it.
And Christ also said that if you be like these wee ones, you won't be in the heaven.
Be like these children, right? And the reason he's saying that, and we already touched on it a little bit, is those are the ones without sin. Those are the ones that are still pure, is how we would easily define it today. Haven't been corrupted. Don't know what, even when they do wrong, they're not doing it out of evil. They're just doing it because they misunderstood, right? And obviously, those of us who've had at least 2-year-olds and continuing know that changes at some point, right? But yeah. All right, let's pick up in chapter 2. We'll read through verse 11 probably. All right. Chapter 2 of Romans, verse 1. Therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. Do you suppose, O man, you who judge those who practice such things and yet do them for yourselves, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But because of your hard and impotent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. He will render to each one according to his works. To those who by patience and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking or contentious and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. Verse 9, there will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. For God shows no partiality. All right. Faith, unrighteous. Then what's he say? I'll let you comment.
Well, I was gonna say, so basically he's saying here, like, in the previous part, he said that there's all these sins, and that we all do them. We just decided that, the disobeying parents. So it's not our place to say one sin is, one sin
Absolutely.
is better than, you are better than any other. Basically, don't judge. Like, it's not your position.
Don't judge is exactly the words my version used, right? Let's see. Every one of you who judges, verse 1, for passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same thing.
This is the hard thing.
Absolutely.
This right here is talking about the Pharisees that was looking at the tax collector and thanking God for me not being like him.
Just change the names and change it to us.
That was that tax collector. Now, judgment, people get screwed up on this thing. There is a place for judgment, and I'm talking with a good heart, because if you see your brother sinning, it says trying to bring him back, and if you don't judge him saying you're doing something wrong, you can't bring him back. You say, well, yeah, he's whatever he's doing, I can't judge him, so let him go. And he goes to burn in hell, and by golly, you find out you are too, because you didn't do anything about it. So there's a difference. There's a difference in judging.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a righteous judgment, there's a judgment, well, I'm a haughty, you know, I'm no way, but I'm sure glad I'm way better than he is. That's what they're thinking about here. But there is a judgment that we gotta do to each other, every brother,
We have
you
to have
know.
discernment. We have to have discernment.
Discernment.
All right, Craig. I'm working on the verse here, but maybe you can just answer it for me. What has changed from the people we just read about to the people you just were talking about?
Well, he talked about, one thing that you notice is what he's talking about, is why you take the speck out of your guy's eye, you know, when you got the log in your eye, you know, that's telling you that you got bigger problems and you're dwelling on his problems and not thinking of your own.
Okay. Well, let me read this verse here because this is really, really important. In verse 4 here in chapter 2. In the last half, really, but let's read the whole verse. Or do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead to repentance? So what I was getting at, and it's a little oversimplified, but let's say here's the difference. Those who are repented, who followed God's kindness to repentance, and are Christians, we need to help lead. We need to, judge is not a bad word. You are right. We need to say, hey, brother, you're following God's grace. You said, I'm going to be a Christian. And tell me when I'm wrong, but you're wrong on this one, right? That's what we're, yeah. But now let's go.
People say, oh, you're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not a very, I don't take very well to that, just so you guys know, when you just say, hey, Harold, you can call me out in front of everybody, and no, that doesn't help me, right? I'll just get upset at you. Here's the opposite, though. Romans chapter 2, where Paul's talking, he's talking to the people of the world, evil people, like you were talking about, too. We have the Pharisees coming out and say, oh, at least I'm not as bad as them, right? And so what he's saying here is not the followers of Christ yet. We're talking about people of the world that are followers of mortal man and creation. That's not who we are to judge. See, there's the two differences there. We are definitely to help our brothers by judging them. Judge is just a discerning word, right? But you're right. Do it kindly, even if it's your brother. Dennis.
Well, it's a lot of people really get hung up on the first few words of Matthew chapter 7, judge not lest you be judged. But if you go ahead and read out the chapter at the end, it's telling you to identify and mark and avoid and maybe judge.
Discern,
So
yeah.
And also, if we don't get judges, we get kings. Israel was led by judges, and it was under God's assignment, and he tried to talk them out of getting a king instead of judges. And the judges is what he really wanted, not kings.
And that whole time, again, I think we know God's whole plan now, but judges sure didn't work out very well for him either, did they? They had some okay ones. But that was about as high as the bar was set. I mean, they had some really bad ones, too. Nancy, I'm not trying to skip you. I'm just finally getting to you. What do you have?
I was just thinking, so many people, when you point out their sin, oh, you're not supposed to judge.
Sure.
I think that's taken so far out of context because we are told that we need to help point out these things in people so that they can, look at themselves and turn their lives. We're not judging them. I'm not judging. I'm not going to say if you don't do it, this is what can happen to you. I'm just pointing out, hey, this is a sin. You should probably do. That's not really. I think they use that. Oh, you're just to shut you up. Oh,
Yeah.
you're
Oh, yeah.
judging me. Just to shut you up. When
Sure.
You're really not judging them. You're doing it out of love. You're not really. You know what I'm saying?
Sure, but we also have this same thing we've been talking about here, is sometimes we walk up to somebody of the world like they're our brother. There's my sister in real, family, my Emily Egger, my sister, can call me out for things that somebody in Walmart cannot, just random person can't call me out for, right? Because she's literally my sister, I'm her brother. And we take that even a step further and bring it to the church. That's who we're supposed to be making sure we're on the right path with. Say, hey, brother, you really messed up this week. And we can help each other. We do it in love. And the difference is, we don't have that relationship. We don't have that rapport. And you're absolutely right. Our culture says, oh, stop judging me. You say anything, you're like, that florist, stop judging me. I was talking about the floor, right? So we do say that, but the point here is, what should we be sharing with those people? Those,
So what?
sure, Nancy got it really good right there. We can even just share verse 11, and that might be enough of a discussion point. For God shows no partiality. What does that mean?
I had a come to Jesus moment on the thing because I'm always like looking at somebody and their sin and I'm just like, oh, and then, talking about it, it's like, oh, I don't need to point out their sin. I need to just teach them about Christ.
Sure.
Because if they know Christ and they love Christ, God says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments.
Yeah.
That's the point and I struggle with that. I need to point out Christ. I need to teach them Christ instead of their sin, and they'll make the decision to turn their lives around and follow Christ when they love
I'll get to you in a second, Craig. So, absolutely, right? The point is not to say how bad of a sinner you are. Look at how bad of a sinner you are. It's just saying everyone. God shows no partiality. Everyone is a sinner. Everyone started there, right? And say, hey, come on in. You don't have to deal with this anymore. But that also leads to another factor here, and this is what Paul's talking about. This is what Kim mentioned here for a second at the beginning. We forget this part. It is the speck in the log situation. How often do we like to call out sin and think, well, we're okay because my sin is just this little one, and I only struggle with it 3 times a week. Doesn't matter. It's a sinner calling out a sinner. Well, what good is that? I mean, that's just, you're getting nowhere. So you're absolutely right. The point is to share the gospel and say, I'm also a sinner. I'm also a sinner. Terry and then Craig, sorry.
I'm not sure I entirely agree with your, I can't get called out by somebody at Walmart. And I'm thinking situations, I worked at State Farm, there in Lander when we worshiped there.
Okay.
And I'm listening to somebody tear up one of my colleagues. Just ugly, rude, and they walk out. There is no part of me that wants to say, I go to church with that person.
Oof. Yeah.
So, and I'm listening to my colleague talk about what a difficult person that was. At what point do I invite my colleague to church and let them get to meet this person who was so rude to them? I think we can get called out.
Yeah.
If you're throwing a hissy fit in line and you're wearing your Riverton Church
Right.
of Christ
That's
shirt,
true.
and somebody behind you goes, boy, he doesn't sound like a Christian. I think you can get called out.
Especially, that was a good example because you were in the family with that person, right? That was the brother, sister. Yeah, you could have, either way, that could have stopped right then. But that's another good factor. You're saying, we bear the church everywhere because it's not the building, it is us. So you're saying, can you be called out because you're not acting like the church? Well, the world knows what the church should look like sometimes. So maybe we can. All right, Craig, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to avoid you.
You're going to say, for there's no partiality with God, goes back to 10, but glory and honor and peace to everyone who does good, to the Jew first and then also to the Greek. But if you're saying the same thing,
Absolutely.
Jews don't get a pass. Christians don't get a pass.
Verse 9 and 10 tie right in there together. There will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and the Greek. And then it says, but glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and the Greek. Just so you know, this is not an order of how they're going to let us into heaven and hell, right? It's not, all Jews come up for. No, this is saying everyone. And Paul's saying it in the language they understand, the 2 nationalities that are, different here, separated, God's people, not God's people. He says, no. Everyone who is evil will be judged on that evil. Everyone who follows God will be judged on following God. So, important.
You skipped out, or you didn't discuss verse 6, and I think that's one of the scariest verses in the Bible.
Which one?
Verse 6.
All right.
That's just terrifying if you really think about it.
Dennis, is yours in regard with verse 6 here?
I think we're talking a lot in a chapter like this one here, a passage like this one here makes us something we all wonder about what they call moral equivalency. You raped and murdered 49 nurses and cut 3 children's heads off. Yeah, but you sassed back to the teacher and we put them on the same level. I don't know, I think we all wrestle with that, but I think the Bible does deal with it. It talks about two servants, one who knew more and one who knew less, and one's beaten with many stripes, and one's beaten with few. And then in the Old Covenant, you see when God given all the rules at Sinai and other times to the Jews, there's these things you put them out of the camp for a week, or you put them out of the camp for a month. Other place you kill them. I mean, there are differences in offenses.
Sure.
And we live by it in our courts and our civil law every day.
And this ties into Terry's comment here about verse 6 is really, really simple. It just says, he will render to each one according to his works. And Terry said, that's scary. Here's the thing. I struggle with this. I don't have an answer for this part. I'll just tell you why I'm struggling with it and where we get. What are we saved by? We're saved by grace, not works. Same author says that. But yet, each will be held accountable by his works. So, to me, those kind of mean the same thing, but different. And so now I'm struggling with okay. Well, we're not talking necessarily about my salvation right here, being given it. It's talking about what will be examined when I get there. That's what verse 6 says, right? Basically, you could reword it and say, what will be examined? What will be your TV screen full of stuff? Well, it'll be all of the stuff you did, all the works. So, that's why it's easy to say, saved by grace, not works, don't have to do anything. No, because we are saved, but now we have to continue to work. We don't get to just be like, I'm saved, let's get back to doing evil. Let's get back to debauchery and sin. Well, no, because what will come is the works. He will judge, or he will render to each according to his works. So, we have salvation. That's never taken away by, it's given by grace. I had to be careful how I said that. It's given by grace. But our works are still important. We can't just go back to doing evil. We got to go live the lives and work and share. So, that's why it's scary.
Is that what it says in James, you see my faith by no works?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Paul echoes that same thing too. Grace. It's grace you are saved, not by your works, right? So, it's just, again, to come back to Terry's comment, we know we're saved, but it's scary because we've got a lot of work to do. And it's not the easy part. It's not just following the world and doing what they're doing. It's stepping outside. When we talked about our new life, it's those new things that we're doing. Yeah. All right, we're very much out of time. We still didn't make it through 2, but we'll get there next week. We'll pick up in verse 12 of chapter 2. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Morning. Are you guys frozen over there?
Oh, it's cold at our house, but we're not frozen.
It's cold everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's funny, I was looking at the weather this morning, I was in San Antonio, and it said 5 degrees. I'm really glad I'm not in San Antonio this week, it's 13. We were out walking around in shirt sleeves, we got a pool, it was gorgeous. The roses are blooming, that's
At the
right.
same level of discussion.
We were there over...
Oh, this is why we're not here, I was
It's crazy.
Oh, ma'am.
Hello, how are you?
Too bad. Yeah, my dad went down.
It's journalism.
No, this is grass here. On this one here, one G.
Now, you're right, you're absolutely right. Acts is kind of like,
Hi, sir.
How are you?
Good.
Acts is kind of like reading about the creation.
Need some coffee or something? Want me to get some coffee? Want me to get some coffee? Oh, good. Good. Taking cold all right? Let me get you off the bat now and call out down here for does it?
I have an announcement.
Gentiles.
Good. for
Saint of me, never make a saint of me.
eager.
Eager. That's no.
Saint Paul persecuted was approved of sin.
Well, good at that.
Jesus did him with wine and light, because like you did.
You got nice blue right.
Oh, thank you.
I will announce.
And
It's in
and his
April.
songs used to be put
Getting
in
started
this.
now.
I haven't heard that one.
Already got
Here's the things I do. Give me the credit for it.
scoured around the state and got the last teacups and stuff. We, so it's hard to believe what I have on my page.
How you doing,
It's gonna be cool.
Good morning. Good to see you.
Turns out okay, maybe it'll be a yearly thing. Yeah, which would be nice.
I see you brought your favorite
We need our time.
daughter-in-law.
Started down the road, started. A lot of work. He said that'll be the way.
It is, that's why we're
Not
starting.
quite sure how that works.
That we have our name picked out and that now it's just getting stuff in church, things like that.
The deep state is so deep, like,
Of course, it's in here.
I mean, I can trust Jesus Christ in that.
I think she'll bring a fun aspect.
I'm not saying it's so either Christian. They're pagan as anybody can be, but I think they know the truth. In that sense, they're
I know, I think I'll get with Blair later.
actually, the words on the songs are
Don't trust me.
the Bible says they're pretty doctrinally correct.
Like, I used to really like, come on, I can't see it.
So now it's just getting a little bit. How are you? I found a big box of writing discs.
And Romney,
I thought, oh,
what the,
that's
and then he's like,
because everybody wants to add to. Yeah, there you go. Spoil us a little bit. That's
I can't believe it. I got it for him. And I was a Romney. And I know him. And I was upset that he lost. And now I'm like, I don't, this is, there's a reason that God didn't allow him to win. Because he was just awful. He was okay.
like he changed.
It was like, the ship was going. And I was
You go, girl. Everything's good.
Hard going on there. But it is, they're,
And then, but most Romneys don't say that.
There it is.
huh.
I always just thought like, Connor, he right there standing up for what was right, and he's not. And I'm like,
Money talk, how you like it is
the love of money.
they're paid.
Well, I don't go for it.
No, this,
So much
this calculator, I don't care.
much
That, that my eyes.
There you go.
But it, you'll get used to it.
By the way,
Yeah.
I remember him
Stay inside.
obsessed with Trump, President Trump at the time, Trump. I kept asking him, and he was like, I don't know how much I got. It wasn't, it's never been important to me. And again, I saw another video where somebody asked him about, you know, his wealth and stuff and his business. He said, it's not about making money. It's not about, it's about doing something that you love. And I love developing real estate. I love doing it. And money's just something that comes. That's not something that adults that love it. You know what I'm saying? And I seen another video. Where he has a huge number of his friends. Because he had all these people just around and just like, oh, this is food, this, you know, just, and then he had made a video about how, he said, you know what, he said, I would really just like, to just lose it in my life. See who stands with me, so I know who my true friends are. He said that like in his 30s. And I'm like, look, it's like he prophesied what was going to happen in the future. He's 30s and just all these people are friends and just he's such a good friend. And look,
Hi, sir. How you this morning?
this whole thing with the foreign countries, and that whatever bill that came out, all of that money that was going on. Then I found out there residential still, you know, there was computers in Pakistan, still in votes. Pakistan, mostly China. They were all, that's why they had money to pay to help him steal the election.
JD come this morning? Goose hunting. Well, good for him.
How are you? Fine, how are you?
I was gonna say, seasonal.
Well, there's a